So, good evening to all of you. So, I'd like to begin by reading a few poems from the earlier collection, which is called The Compass Bird. And I thought I'd begin actually with the title poem because it may seem like a strange, mysterious kind of title. So, The Compass Bird is a sequence of 3 poems. And I'll first read them. The Compass Bird. 1. Look at that bird sitting on the slow water. The others are facing ahead, but this one is turned as if to see where it has come from. But first, it passes the empty boat and then is brought about slowly to face forward. Now it is with the crowd. No, it has begun rotating the other way, as if it were a compass needle and the earth were being reversed. 2. Fast and low, they are converging like dawn raiders from the steppes. Here is no resistance. They land without a splash. There is place for them all between this cluttered bank and a haze of empty shore and water. One is being gently revolved, its wings in a bind, and the black-topped head is calm. Look, this is not the end. Those round eyes that see everything are far from done. 3. And today, they are not here. Nothing else is missing. The bathers and the gaudy boats and a semi-covered drain that's clogged. The river distributes the sun's first reflection below the bridge. Dark birds crowd the gunnels like pilgrims. Though the river has a lot to carry, they need not have gone. One of them could still be going round in slow eddies between the compass points. A scrutiny that stops at nothing.
Okay, audible, right? Yeah. So thank you. This is actually the last poem in the first section, and at least on my reading of this book, the collection coheres as a collection. Not all collections of poems demand to be read. Not that this poem can't be read by itself, but I think it yields a different sense if you read it from start to finish, and you arrive at this poem at the end of the first section. And why do I say that? These are just my thoughts. You don't have to agree with that, but there is a sense of cumulation, right? So you read of these birds. The first section comprises of 30-something poems, entirely on birds of various sorts, everyday birds that the speaker encounters. And then you arrive at this poem, The Compass Bird, which is not exactly a bird. It's not clear what it is, right? What this poem shares with the earlier poems is a structure, a mode of address. So look at how it opens. Look at that bird. Who's being addressed here? The reader or the speaker to himself, the speaker addressing himself. That ambiguity persists, in fact, across both books. The second person address, right? Does this poem use the you directly? No, it doesn't. Doesn't, right? Yeah, but even so, look at that bird perhaps arguably implies the you, given the persistence of the you across. So the implicit use of the you here triangulates consciousness in the sense that there is the speaker conscious of that bird, but also the speaker conscious perhaps of himself or herself, and the bird, which may or may not be conscious. In some poems, the bird is conscious of the speaker who is conscious of the reader, right? And sometimes the bird is not. So there is, I think, across this book and perhaps many of the poems in Lone Pine, a sort of triangle. One is always sort of, when you to read any of these poems is to step into a triangle between the speaker, the you, who's ambivalently the speaker himself, or me being, the reader, and the bird or the animal or the creature, this sort of life, typically non-human, not always though, who is somewhat conscious, who is sometimes serenely unconscious or oblivious to, but often conscious of the speaker, right? And so I don't know what all that means. I mean, what it adds up to, but I think it arrests me when I read. And this, so when one reads of all these birds, which largely have proper names, the bee eater, the chickadee, the magpie robin. There's a poem called Balance of Power, which speaks of babblers and pigeons. So these are the seven sisters, which are, of course, kinds of birds. Then you arrive at this poem, which is not exactly about any one bird. It's the compass bird. Are they compass birds in the sense that they exist in every direction, right? Or are they sort of, when I first read this poem, I thought maybe they're birds at the head of a boat, like a masthead, a wooden bird or a metal bird. It's not clear, which is also important, I think, because I don't think either of these two books are directly, let's say, I don't think they are first order transcriptions of what the speaker of any of these poems sees or hears or smells. They are transcriptions of a consciousness that is conscious of what is seen or heard or smelled, right? So you're not actually reading directly of birds. You're reading of someone conscious of birds or ants or a nilgai and so forth. I think that's really important, that distinction, because you see in this poem, as in several of the other poems, the speaker keeps correcting himself. There's a tentativeness which inscribes itself into the syntax. So look at this. Now it is with the crowd. No, it has begun rotating the other way, as if it were a compass needle. Further down at the end of the second poem in the compass bird, look, this is not the end. Those round eyes that see everything are far from done. Who's being persuaded here, right? There's a tentativeness. So I thought, do you want to respond to any of this now? Would you rather not? And I say all this and you keep reading.
Well, you're saying a great deal, and thank you. Yeah, I think that's.
You don't have to. I'm just saying you don't.
I'd like to respond to one thing in particular, which is that it seems to me that many of these poems, as you said, are about the consciousness of the person who's there, who's present in the poems. So there's an object that's being looked at, but it's also the act of looking that's being looked at. And that's what interests me. And the looking actually, in many of these poems, it seems to me, becomes a two-way thing. Particularly, I would say here, where the poem begins, the first poem is about looking at this bird, which mysteriously is floating backwards and then sort of turns around, faces all the compass points and in between them as well. But by the third section, it's the speaker who feels he's being scrutinized. So what I'd like to do is, I'd just like to, if it's okay with you, read another poem.
Absolutely.
In fact, another sequence of poems, again, 3 poems, where this sort of two-way looking is really at the heart of what's happening. And this poem is called Nilgai, and Nilgai, of course, are these large antelope that you find. Many of these poems, by the way, are written in Banaras, so that's the setting. And this poem has an epigraph, and it's from, the epigraph goes, she saw them in their field, they her in hers. And the she is referring to a deer. And this is from a poem by Robert Frost called Two Look at Two, where there are 2 people who are on a walk up a hill and they see these 2 deer. So Nilgai, 1. A movement on the lawn. Look up to see the antelope standing there in the open beyond a hanging screen of leaves and watching you. She sidesteps unhurriedly to see you better and fixes her eyes on yours. The trees have ended breathing, the sun has paused. Things have never been so clear. As you look this morning, you are being looked at as if nothing else was the matter. This should not move on, you think resignedly. And it does. So, this at the end of that poem is not just that particular female Nilgai, but that moment of looking itself. And those moments tend to dissipate in a state of inattention. So 2. Now it is the male, a bluish ripple over the sun-drenched earth. Mid-morning winter, when everyone is outside, he is the phantom breathed by a forest, the ghost who walks. Impossible to know the pathways by which he comes, or at whom his eyes will be directed. Now he is gliding towards a shut gate. A tree is skirted. He has left not a sign of his earthly passage. He was here with disappearance in view, like a worldly saint. 3. Your harmlessness you take for granted. So when you hear a crash of hooves in the wilderness beside your path and see the fleeing rumps of Nilgai, you're taken by surprise. Why should your early morning walk be so calamitous? Your tread is light, and one of them has stood her ground just beyond the barbed wire. She does not look at the runaways, but squarely at you. What can you say when you are being eyed like this? That you have never intended harm? That you only want to pass unnoticed? Be loved and forgotten? Try another beneath a gaze that stops at nothing.
So a gaze that stops at nothing recalls a scrutiny that stops at nothing, which is the last line of Compass Bird, that poem, right? So when I was trying to make sense of, I was trying to see if there was an overarching kind of lyric logic to this book. I thought, and I'm still tentative about this, that the lyric logic that binds the book as a collection together is a consciousness that tries out or sort of tries out for fit a variety of metaphors and conventions drawn from the sort of the cultural encyclopedia of whatever's available, pop songs, Greek myth, Ramayana, whatever, and finds itself falling short of the encounter with the Nilgai or a bird or some. I think in this collection it's entirely non-human life forms, and so there's a poem earlier which is called Red and Grey, which is it doesn't say ants, but I think it comes across. You read it and you kind of infer these are probably ants or insects, which the speaker raises up, and so sort of this magnification, which then leads the speaker to correct assumptions about these creatures. Here, you notice the speaker watching the Nilgai has his expectations corrected by attention, but here not attention, not miniaturization, but by motion and stillness. Like, as you look this morning, you are being looked at as if nothing else was the matter. This should not move on, you think resignedly, and it does. Right? Motion corrects expectation. And why should your early morning walk be so calamitous? Expectation defeated, right? And beneath a gaze that stops at nothing. So you're sort of pinned to the spot by a gaze. So many of these poems are about being unmastered by looking. Where looking should be masterful, you're sort of pinned like a butterfly onto a cushion, right? By what looks back at you. It's as if you didn't write these poems. It's as if the poem was co-authored with the Nilgai or with whatever you're looking at.
It's an interesting way of putting it, because of course it's looking that's really the subject of these poems. And so you're looking, you're being looked at, the thing you're looking at is looking, and there's no end to it. Maybe I'll just read one more. I think I'm more comfortable reading poems than speaking about them. So we'll divide the load. Right, okay. So this is a poem called Snail. And here, I think you see the kind of triangulation that Prashant was speaking about. Snail. Have you watched a seashell snail on a granite flagstone after rain? How smooth it is on a rough surface, how asymmetrical. Its trail spools behind it through a dark puddle. No part of it appears to move, and yet, with its head erect, it is inexorably on its way to the crevice between this stone and the next. Does it know a crossing lies ahead? An inch short of the border, it falls into a reverie. The horns incline one way, then try languidly the other. It feeds on air as it sits or as it stands. Time to move on. This is what it knows. The motionless advance resumes towards its horizon, which is nearing now rapidly. A pause at the edge. The neck and the horns droop into the fissure for something between the stones, or possibly for nothing beyond the new splashes of mud. How much is enough to watch of a snail on stone and water? Time always to move on. So I think the question with which the poem ends is something that interests me because, of course, you're watching, and when you're watching, there's a kind of quality of attention that becomes you at that moment. But invariably, there's something that ends it. There's creature disappears, you have something to do. So where does one stop? And how much is enough? And is it in fact a matter of time as we normally measure it? Or does that attention have, even in a moment, a kind of intensity that makes it interesting, worthwhile? So I'm interested also in this question of time here, really, right?
Could you say something about what that means for the forms of your poems? You're saying that the poems don't really end. There's a closure imposed on them by contingency, by accident. You have to move on. There are other things to do. The creature disappears. These are things not in your hands. That ends the poem. What does that mean for the craft of your poems? How do you end them?
Well, when the creature moves on, or when your attention moves on.
I mean, you don't, there are traditional ways of forms of closure, rhyme, end rhyme, stanzas. You don't use those. You're not a poet of the stanza and of the rhyme from what I can make out. You're a poet of idioms, which are often rehearsed or tested only to be shown up as failing. You work with syntax, with line breaks, with spaces. Um, that sort of set of the panoply of techniques. How does it, or does it? I mean, maybe you haven't thought about this, but that's okay if you haven't. But how does that sort of speak to the central role of accident in your poems?
Yeah, I think the word accident is probably useful here. So there's perhaps a kind of accidental quality to the form in many of these poems. Very few of them in The Compass Bird are in regular stanzas. There are stanza breaks. The lines are not really metrical, and yet I wouldn't call them entirely free verse. They're somewhere in the space between. And I think these aspects of the poem are determined by the circumstances really in which the poem is being written. So, for example, there's a poem in another creature poem, as it happens, in Lone Pine, about an encounter with an owl. And the whole thing seemed to happen in a sort of semi light, in there was a sort of quality of rush about it because one never knows when the owl is going to move off. And I think what happens in that poem, which is written in one fairly long stanza, is the the movement, actual or potential, of the owl is what determines that long kind of paragraph which creates the poem. Would you like to hear it?
Please.
Okay, yeah. So this is again actually in another 3-poem sequence called Taking Off. Lone Pine doesn't have too many poems about animals, but this is one of the poems. As I said, it's a sequence of 3 poems, and they're all 3 about encounters with different birds that at some point take off. So that explains the title. And so the poem I was talking about is the first one, which is called Shortcut. You take the shortcut across the lawn's relentless night shadows. You notice as you come near the lamppost end a smallness on the path. Why does it not move at your approach? You pass it and stop to look. An owlet, 3 feet from you and standing on the hardened earth, but bent slightly backward to see you unwinkingly, the better. You look at one another. It begins to sway its head from side to side, a rocking doll, a stuffed cobra, an owlet. You are mesmerized. It is too, but why? You are not swaying before it, and it must have seen others pass this way. Is it putting on a show so you know what it can do on this earth? Or only to convey that you have trespassed and should have taken the long way round? But is it injured, grounded when it must have a tree to which it belongs? You take a step towards it and it stops its swaying. A squeak, or was it a squawk? Then a flying low away from you, the quickest route taken to a space untouched by light, by shadows, by you. So, in this poem, I think the sense I have of this poem is it's a sort of poem that's capturing an experience in real time with all of its uncertainty and excitement. And the stanza breaks, therefore, weren't necessary. So I guess my answer to your question is, I think questions of form, as I suppose would be the case in all poetry, are really determined by the nature of the experience. And I think I'm too lazy a poet to try and create regular forms. And when I've tried, it hasn't worked.
I think you're too skeptical a poet, you're skeptical of these forms. Rather, so it's the opposite of lazy. There's a at least in this particular collection, Compass Bird, I see a skepticism about traditional forms. Maybe that's an occasion to read the one on Mary Poppins.
Oh, you want that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's an example of this. I mean, it uses it cites a movie, so it dips into popular culture, but it also dips into Valmiki Ramayana. All kinds of. This particular poem is Mary Poppins.
Well, I think my generation grew up with musicals like Mary Poppins, And there's a song in Mary Poppins that goes, "Feed the birds." It's a lullaby. And it's a poem about feeding birds. Feed the birds. In Mary Poppins, it was dreamlike. Here are no apostles and saints in the battle square of empire, looking down smilingly each time someone shows a care for the birds whose young are hungry and whose nests are exposed. Only you are here to notice through an upstairs window the little bird woman approach the clay basin with her bowl of rice and peanuts, her head protected by a towel and a stick in hand to ward off pigeons and crows. No lullaby this, no smiling into a cozy dream. This is a recipe for war.
Yeah, so you see
Yeah.
a sort of a quiet negation of the dreamlike quality of the song, of the video. Watch Mary Poppins, and you can go to YouTube and just see this particular song, right? It's a quiet negation of it. What was dreamlike turns out to be a recipe for war. But this is the kind of testing for fit. You know, it's like trying to, what are the idioms? I don't know, but you're trying to square a circle or whatever the idiom is, you know, but this sort of testing for fit and finding it fails and a wry sense of failure. Uh, Not lugubrious like in Keats. Now I thought of a model for this. Do I recognize this testing for fit in finding it failing? The only model I know for it would be Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, right? Where the speaker tries out, he thinks poetry will accomplish what Greek myth once accomplished, finds it fails. He finds a variety of things fail, a variety of solutions from culture fail for its fail, and the Nightingale still eludes what, you know, sort of his linguistic efforts at capturing the Nightingale elude him, right? And that's the poem. The poem rehearses a sort of sequence of failures. But it's rather lugubrious, and, you know, sort of that particular poem. That's not the mood of Siddharth's poems. There's a wry, playful sense of failure, right? I find, and a playful resignation to by the consciousness. The consciousness either falls back on conventions that it knows are mere conventions which fail, or it corrects itself, right? With the Nilgai moves when it wasn't expecting it to, right? Or the ants turn out to be more than it or other than it expected when they lift it up on your fingers. So a variety of forms of experience correct consciousness or let it fall back on convention as mere artifice, right? Um,
So, since we're on the subject of looking, um, maybe I'll read another poem now from Lone Pine, which is again about seeing and poetry. In fact, the title is "Seeing Becomes a Poem." And of course, there's a pun in the title. It's an unfortunate thing when one falls into punning, but what to do?
There's also one of the last.
Okay. Yeah. So seeing becomes a poem. It began on the walkway through the scrub. Dawn was on the other side of trees. A kukal marked time invisibly. A rustling of leaves turned your head. They saw you when you saw them. Three jackals paused what they were doing. The rustling ceased. Your footsteps died. Beyond the jackals, a nilgai stopped. It turned its head towards you. Eyes were trained on you. Yours were not so steady. The thin trees cast no shadows. The kukul was going deep. Seeing had fixed you on a tightrope. Something had to give. The jackals went about their business. The nilgai turned away. A balance slipped out of your hands. You landed on a pile of words. Brushed them off carefully. They are tattered, almost poetic. Dawn is all over the place. Nothing is so becoming. So, one of the things that this poem draws on, apart from looking and being looked at, is the idea of being on a tightrope. And I think that's probably important to the way these poems work, because at any moment, um something can slip, or rather, you can slip, and that would be fatal in more ways than one. In fact, it's an image that sort of underlies a poem in an earlier book. Uh, the book before these two was a book called On the High Wire, whose title poem sort of establishes this metaphor. In fact, may I just read that? Yeah, I happen to have a copy here. It's a short poem. It's called On the High Wire. How sickening that you step out, no net, no harness, and a 50-story shiver where people squint against the night sky. There is no reversing here. To be 7 steps out or 700 is equally to be in the void with a pole whose ends are arcing gently. Here, truly, to say that every step counts is more than aphoristic. Do you number each sliding stride as a poet might discount syllables? When you are afraid that every word set down would cast you off this thread. So I would say this is a real fear for me when I'm writing, because there's something that occasions the poem. And of course, when you're writing, the mind is sometimes too clever for the good of the poem. All kinds of things come into it, which may actually take you off your thread, really. And I think the writing of poetry is often, for me at least, a kind of act of recovery, of trying to restore what is authentic to a poem. So I work very slowly, and there's a lot that I need to jettison before I'm clear that this is a complete poem and and a true poem.
Speak of
Yeah.
authenticity and recovery,
Yeah.
but this poem, Seeing Becomes a Poem, actually seems to originate in loss and displacement, right? So a balance slipped out of your hands, you landed on a pile of words. So the poem displaces the sort of, you lose balance on your tightrope of seeing and being seen.
Yeah.
You clatter down, you tumble down onto a pile of words. And the pile of words also seems to be dawn, because dawn is all over the place, right? You brush the words off you, they're tattered, almost poetic. Dawn is all over the place, which suggests, just by syntactic juxtaposition, that the sort of tattered dawn is also the poem. And nothing is so becoming is also a pun, if you think
Yes.
about it, right?
Yes, of course. I think, I think what happens is, what's interesting about encounters with animals is the sort of the fact that you're encountering something that is living but doesn't think the way you do, and therefore the encounter is unpredictable. And that's interesting because when you also encounter things in yourself which are uncanny, and again, hard to set down, and also unpredictable in how long they'll stay for you to be able to look at them before they move on. So in this poem, of course, a kind of tension is built in that moment when there are jackals, the Nilgai, and you're all looking at each other. And there's the kukul in the background, which has this deep sort of sound. And then the moment breaks, right? And the fact that the moment breaks is not in your control. The moment breaks because the animals turn away, right? And then all you have is memory, really. And is memory a legitimate ground for a poem? I suppose it has to be. And yet it's not, you're not catching that moment in the quick. You're catching the moment uh, partly in the quick, but partly as a kind of, as a lag.
So,
Yeah.
I, I don't know if you don't have to answer this, but it's
Yeah.
more of a comment. You may not, but you know that when I read this collection, I thought of other 20th century projects, poetic projects, which are inspired by or provoked by animal encounters. Right? You have Les Murray from Australia, who has this collection, Translations from the Natural World, where he pushes English to its grammatical or virtually unintelligible limits in trying onomatopoetically to speak like a bat. He has a poem called Bat's Ultrasound, where he replicates the ultrasound of bats while still remaining just within English grammatical acceptability. You have Marianne Moore's long poems, which are not onomatopoetic, but you have what's called the octopus, right? Which is in fact a mountain, and it's an extended exercise in mapping an octopus onto a mountain, or an actual mountain. You have of course Rilke at the beginning of the 20th century. You have the jaguar panther, right? So you have a series of, and these are distinctively 20th century attempts. I don't think they go further back, where these are attempts to renew lyric language or expand its sort of expressive scope by through a kind of mimesis of different sorts of non-human life, right? You have Ted Hughes, of course, the Thought Fox, which reminds me of this particular poem, right, where there's a kind of shamanistic transformation of fox into poem. What is your relationship, if any, with all of those projects which go back 100 years at most, where lyric form is renewed through encounters with non-human life?
I think I just don't know enough about it. So I haven't read Les Murray, for example. I've read some of Marion Moore's poems. Of course, Ted Hughes, and Ted Hughes wrote a great deal about animals, but I think in a pretty different way from how I write about animals. I think for Hughes, the animals are much more consciously emblems of something or the other. Though, of course, the poems are brilliant because they're uh, so true to to nature as well. Um, I think when the Compass Bird was written, it isn't as if I set out to write a book about animals. It just so happened that over the years I'd written a number of poems to do with what I encountered, typically early morning, which is when I write, and I happen to live in places uh, which were rich in animal life, even though they were urban. So Banaras, for example, in the campus where I was living, and it was endlessly fascinating to watch these creatures and write about them. So your question about this tradition that you were speaking about, I don't think I was really conscious of that tradition as I was writing. But maybe the fact that Hughes certainly was a poet I was quite familiar with, maybe the fact that others had done it uh, gave me a kind of confidence that it could be done.
Yeah, it strikes me. I don't know how many of you know this essay from the 1970s by John Berger called Looking at Animals, where he argues that what's distinctive about the visual culture of capitalist city as opposed to say pre-capitalist cities is you don't you don't have accidental encounters with wildlife, even ordinary wildlife. Whereas pre-capitalist cities, you had, I mean, think of even India, until the 1950s, 60s, you had cows in your, not necessarily wild animals, but sort of even farm animals, right? You don't look at animals and you're not looked at. You're not sort of, pinned down by a wild stare. That's what he really means in looking at animals. And so such animals as you do have in modern cities tend to be either in zoos or pets onto whom you anthropocentrically map, you sort of, you pin human identities onto them, give them human names and so forth. But a lot of these poems are urban poems, and yet they are about looking and being looked at by various forms of wildness, right? So that's just a comment I had. Could you tell us about another influence, another reading sort of influence for you, who's not exactly poetic, Krishnamurti, Jiddu Krishnamurti, and how that matters to the poetics of looking and being looked at?
Well, just very briefly, because I happen to have worked for many years in schools founded by Krishnamurti, I think attention to what is an important element of his thinking. And you see, so my poems really begin there. It may be animals, but not all of my books are animal poems, and I'm quite ignorant. I may write poems in which I know the names of birds, and so I name them, but I'm quite ignorant about birds, animals, and so on. But it's the act of attention, I think, in which something happens, right? You may be attentive to an animal, you may be attentive to a word, to some other kind of experience you've had, to trees, to anything really. And in that, it's an attention that's to an object as well as to your experience of the object, and the two are distinct. And I think when those two sort of come together, something interesting happens. You start seeing things in new ways and interesting ways. And it turns out that everything is interesting. Um, Maybe I'll pause there. I don't want to sort of talk too much about Krishnamurti. Yeah. Well, I mentioned trees, so maybe I'll read a couple of tree poems, right? I'd like to read these poems because they sort of uh, introduce a theme that I discovered was preoccupying me somewhat. Uh, and I'll tell you what the theme is after I read the first poem. And this is the title poem of this book. It's called Lone Pine. And the subject of this poem actually exists in our campus in Banaras. Mysteriously, there's a pine tree. And the pine trees in India belong squarely in the mountains. So this tree has no business being there, but it is there. Lone pine. A mountain pine in the plains. How did it come in this unfrequented alley? How does it survive so out of place? It towers gawkily above the rear of the building. Walk past it every morning to touch its toughness. Its needles are dropping always. They are the sponginess you tread. A few are caught in the bark's rigid flakes. Gently prise them out. Release them to fall where they belong. They cover dust and flatness with the scent of resin slopes. That arrival, a return. The car with shut windows had wound through a pine forest. At last you stood on a ridge in the blue, forgotten air, through which the great trees were a dry redolence. It seemed that this was it, belonging. Home was this. But the pines kept murmuring something else. You are a guest wherever you are. Home is out of place. So I think this whole question of belonging and of where is home and of what is it to be an outsider, and underlying these, the questions of identity. You see, I'm not a systematic thinker, but I find that there are many poems in which these concerns seem to appear. So I'll just read maybe two more. This is also a tree poem. It's called Eucalyptus. Yeah, it's the next poem. Eucalyptus. They are culpable of drawing the water there is to great lengths. Some say that being outsiders, they should not remain. Others say that an outsider is God. Look at this one. It's paired to the bone glow that sets it apart from the dark profusion of natives all around. It is the first to be lit, its lean intensity to draw the sun, ray by ray, to this native earth. May I read one more?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Uh, I'd also like to look at this question in another sort of context. And this is a poem called Outsider. There were news reports at one point of time that there were people in Banaras who felt that the ghats of Banaras should be closed to everybody except Hindus. And maybe this poem is partly a response to that, though it doesn't refer to it directly. Outsider. Outsiders must learn this river's code. Today the sun will be shrouded, but the bare-bodied men at water's edge know when it is time. Nothing can stop their moment, a conch. They raise water in their palms and hail the rising they cannot see. Their voices carry the day. One of them is doing something expansive with a cupped flame. Their call makes light of sludgy steps. It has gone up through tree and temple to rouse once forgiving streets. This call, you remember from storybooks, was raised in war against infidels. Now it so inflames piety. Outsiders must learn to lie low.
Maybe, well, could I go back to the earlier poem, Eucalyptus, right? To talk about just something, the second poem. Three parts technically, but really there's a kind of a space between sort of two stanzas or paragraphs, right? The first is really about talk. Some say that being outsiders, they should not remain. Others say that an outsider is God. Then there's a space. And then you say, because says, look at this one. And it comes to a certain kind of conclusion. It is the first to be lit, its lean intensity to draw the sun ray by ray to this native earth. So the second part cuts through mere talk by looking. Looking establishes a truth that mere talk cannot, right? The primacy of experience over talk. Also, the syntactical wobbling. It is the first to be lit, its lean intensity to draw the sun is not a sentence. It's two clauses, right? With line break, which also suggests that looking disables linguistic mastery. But at least it causes it to wobble, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a very interesting observation. And looking in some ways runs counter maybe to some of the positions that we take on various things. So, eucalyptus, it depends on from where you're looking at it, right? How you're considering it. If as an environmentalist, you would object to it, to eucalyptus, but you might not if you look at it from another perspective. And finally, um, this whole question of should it be here, should it not be here? The point is, it is here. And while it's here, it needs to be noticed.
Maybe, since you read this one just after this one, the one you read just now, after Eucalyptus, which is, and you mentioned the Banaras context, the Ghat, the politics of the Ghats. You have a sort of a quiet relationship with politics. The poetry, right, seems to be, maybe not you, your poetry, has a kind of a quiet relationship with politics in India, which is one of the things I admire about it, as I do. This is also what I see in certain 17th century Persian poets and their relationship with politics. They're really interested in ontology, not in the goings on of culture, of politics and so forth, but and levels of reality where politics and its hustle and bustle goes on at another level, and you provincialize politics by looking intensely, right, at the river Ghats, at the eucalyptus, right, and it's a kind of politics tends to be, penumbral, right?
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Prashant. And that sort of leads me into maybe a couple of, again, I'd like to say less, maybe read more. And but you're right. There was a time when I was maybe somewhat naively convinced that politics and poetry should have nothing to do with each other. But I think I've modified that view. And I'd like to read two poems, if I may. One is, again, from a sequence. As you'll see, I seem to be fond of sequences. And the story behind this is not that I set out to write a sequence, but I happen to write poems often on things which are connected. And then I'm embarrassed by how many they are. So I sort of string them together and call it one thing. So there's a series of poems which I've called River Mornings, which is about the river in the morning in Benares. And I'd like to read one which where this kind of sidelong glance at politics, let's say, comes in. And then I'd like to read another where it's more explicit. Well, maybe a third, let's see. Okay, so River Mornings, and this is the first poem in the sequence. It's called Colors. Look down there at the blue umbrella sticking up with its white florals from the small brown boat that hugs the bank of the grey and rained-on river. The wind pushes wavelets ahead of the flow. The furrows take on every hue that the current tunnels beneath. Another boat is being muscled against the surge by a man in a black t-shirt. For a moment, he rests his oars, then pulls past the umbrella and past a rain-darkened peacock that stands on the motley debris left by a river that might be green or silver. It might be anything. Unlike on mornings that a saffron glaze becomes a hard glitter. So, I won't explain the poem. It probably doesn't need to be explained. But I'd like to read one more, which sort of addresses the question Prashant raised fairly explicitly. It's a poem called Skimming, page 116. And the poem has an epigraph. I have this unfortunate habit of stealing, right? And here I've stolen from Wilfred Owen and from the preface that he was writing to his poems shortly before he was killed in the First World War. And what he says is, my subject is war and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. Skimming. Quote unquote. Politics makes for bad poetry, you once thought to declare. Was your subject poetry, or the fallout when power struts its hour bestrewing the ground with half-eaten fruit. Poetry is unembarrassed to find some kinds of wasting beautiful. It has its head down as it scuffs its shoes on the shores of what it does not know, questing for a smooth stone to skim. It is easy to ignore. Politicking is that motorboat, slickly fitted out and gleaming as it churns the rough water, its flag ablaze with information and intent, its wake turning the surface white. It shows no sign of going under. It races up and down and crosswise, leaves its mess spreading wherever it goes, so it is hard to ignore. Once in a way, you listen to the lake as it is being skimmed. You follow the diminishing hits until the surface tension breaks and a thing is lost to water. You could have remarked that poetry picks up residual stones to fling in the interstices of war.
Do you want to read my?
Okay, you should try just read another political poem.
Or what did we have planned? Maybe something on metapoetic themes in your, maybe writing in winter, prickly heat.
Okay.
He has according to me anyway, the second section of this book comprises poems that are about writing poetry. The metapoetic in that sense. And so I find them very revealing about a certain genesis of the lyric, which reflects on its own genesis.
Again, I should say I'm grateful to Prashant for drawing my attention to this. But these poems began simply out of the fact that the weather is so variable in Banaras. And writing in Banaras in either winter, deep winter, or in deep summer can be a challenge. So there are two sort of companion poems. The first is called Writing in Winter. They're very short poems. Writing in winter. This is the cold of swollen fingers and branches carved by the mist. Night sounds stay on for longer now, but they are muffled. The desk shows no sign of a thaw. Entrust it with all you carry. Let the pen do its thing, scoring here and there as fingers skid. And the other poem is called Prickly Heat. On days of prickly heat, poetry stays away. On days of poetry, prickly heat lies low. There must be a lesson in their not coming together. Some untruth as well. For who would resist a poem's itch?
So the previous poem, Writing in Winter, it's as if writing here is not quite volitional, beyond the entrusting and the letting. You say, entrust the desk, entrusted with all you carry. Let the pen do its thing, scoring here and there as fingers skid. Right? So the desk and the pen sort of, they freeze and accidentally score or hit the mark. Right? So the desk and the pen are frozen versions of the opening branches and swollen fingers. So the speaker, you, is unmastered by perception. Again, what is seen unmasters the seer and results in a poem.
Yeah.
You really co-authored all these poems with the weather, with animals and birds.
Yeah, I seem to need these props. Yeah.
Also, prickly heat. For who would resist a poem's itch? Again, it implies an involuntariness to a poem that comes like an itch in prickly heat. Right? So it's as if the term of consciousness overwhelms the consciousness, result in a poem. Again, but the idea of course, involuntariness is an ancient pedigree in poetry, one sees in Plato, but that's not the kind of involuntariness like in Plato's Ion, famous dialogue, where there is divine frenzy that descends on this man who goes to the festival of the goddess Athena. But that's not the genealogy, or not even the romantic, not even the kind of romantic genealogy of inspiration we are talking about here, right? It's a different kind of involuntariness where you submit to very earthly, worldly perceptions and pressures on your neurophysiology, and so it's a different sort of. I don't know if there's a genealogy for it. It's certainly not Ted Hughes's kind of shamanism, right? It's a different kind of submission to perception that impels you into a poem, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's nicely put. Yeah. I think it's good to remember the other thing that Wordsworth said, apart from, emotions overflowing and all of that. He also spoke about recollection and tranquility. And I think that's an important aspect of the writing process. So there is an experience which is an itch. It calls on you to respond, or it's sliding around on ice and you don't know which way it's going. And there's the other part of you that wants to make sense of this thing. And I suppose that's the experience of anybody who writes poetry. I, I imagine so. I don't know. There are a lot of poets in this room, so maybe I shouldn't be saying such things. Yeah. Maybe I'll just read one or two more and then we can open it up. Yeah, there are okay. I think one of my concerns also is, as a poet, and it's not a particularly original concern, which is, and it's this that is it a case of Nero fiddling while Rome burns? Because of course there's a lot of stuff happening in the world, and okay, you're writing about animals and the weather and about saffron sitting comfortably somewhere. So I suppose the question is finally, what sense do these poems have? What relevance do they have? I don't know if that's even the right question. You could say that the act of attention needs no justification. And if it results in a poem, so be it. It could result in something else as well. But I think that question is there somewhere in some of these poems, and maybe I'll read out one or two of those. So I'd like to first read a poem which was inspired partly by a poem in Vivek's book, After. I'm so delighted that Vivek is here today. And the poem is called, again, That Wretched Drek. And it draws, as again, I apologize, I have quotes. And the first is from Vivek's After. And the line goes, and they saw no longer the battlefield. And the second is again Owen. I mean the truth untold, the pity of war, the pity war distilled, which is from Owen's remarkable, beautiful poem, Strange Meeting. And the poem is about the word drek, which means, in case you're not familiar with it, something like stuff that's unnecessary, rubbish. No escaping this word. It grates finely as if it almost carried all our histories of friendly fire. Whether to call it wretched, like calling fresh water sweet, or war a pity, the true word sounds itself. We are led in strange unseeingness to bayonets being piled onto the wordless people they ended. We pause to intone to the hollowed earth. You were the enemy I killed, my friend. Words are almost drek. Almost drek. Anyway, there's Another, yet again, a sequence of poems that I found myself writing. These are perhaps the most recent poems in this book. A sequence of poems about music. And the title of this sequence is Concert. And the poems are based on the experience of being in 2 or 3 concert halls over a period of time and being somewhere uneasily aware of things that were happening outside the concert hall. So I'd like to read 2 of those poems. The first is called Hall. The river catches the last light of day. You cross the road and mount the broad stairs, follow directions to the correct portal of this unruined acropolis. Red carpets and long chandeliered hallways. At the box office, your stacked ticket is retrieved if you show proof of identity. It comes enveloped and is bestowed on you like a birth certificate. With it in hand, you are ushered up staircases by liveried survivors stationed at every turn. Kind and smiling, one of them guides you through a door with a gilded knob to the very chair you had envisaged online all those months ago. The view is good. From your balcony, you see a precious world. You do not know if you belong. But you are certified in place on time to hear a cacophony of tuning and sounding. How adept they are at dissonance. Somewhere a bell and the hall lights dim for silence to descend. Now we are ready to begin. This river once was a frontier of war where something apparently was settled. Events these many months remind us that there is always more settling of scores, more rendering ticketless, homeless, limbless, less. Out of syncness is a threat, but here disparate noises are harmonized. The hall allows us to forget, despite our tiered vantage points, that certificates of dying are not for everyone. Forget too in music's dying fall the true acoustics of revenge. I'll read you one more from the sequence. It's called Double Basses, which are, of course, these large versions of violins. During the intermission, you see from your seat above the stage 5 double basses supine like beached whales or jumbo jets. They are quite useless where they lie, but have lost none of the sheen you noticed during the slow movement when you peered over the balcony. The bows in steady unison drew up a message from the deeps. Here was soulful death, and here a readiness to take to the skies, to air the hall-wide intelligence that war can always be survived. I'd like to read one last poem for now, and then maybe we can, if there's any questions. It's called Watching the Match. We sit high in the floodlit stands. The action looks small. Huge screens give us a closer view. Blood on turf glitters under lights. Our brute sympathies, we say, are with the underdog. Our gesticulations are caught on screen and alter nothing. This is the time of the overdog. We should switch allegiances. Referees run along the sidelines and blow their whistles. This adds to the spill of red on green, the squelching of those who still play. Some have lost heart. If it comes their way, they kick the ball to be rid of it. Some kick themselves. We stand and applaud. Despite the wetness in our boots, attempt a Mexican wave.
What I was thinking a lot about for a while is the animals as co-authors of the poems, right? And because they're also looking back at us through these poems, that not strictly co-authors, and they don't have a say in the, but there's a quality of receptiveness, maybe a cautiousness as to how to read, what this animal is communicating in its look, right? But the animal is also playing with that difficulty of interpretability. But your poems have that very definite quality of sort of recognizing these beings and these encounters with beings with whom we don't share language. So yeah, can you say? I mean, I wanted to maybe dwell more on that also as well. Um, what is it that we read from an animal's look? Or, what is it that's happening when they also have a theory of us? Yeah, yes.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm sort of responding on the fly because it's not something I've really thought deeply about. I think the way our look differs perhaps from the look of the animal is that, well, as far as we know, ours is, of course, accompanied by various kinds of things, thoughts, expectations, desire to hold on, because any encounter with the wild is precious. And animals, it seems, are looking with a lot less of all of that. Perhaps, again, I'm being tentative here because what do we really know of the way animals think and feel? But it feels as if animals are, when they look at you, are first of all wary. And in the case of the Nilgai, for example, there's a sense of something that's unwavering. I don't know if any of you have been looked at by Nilgai, but they look with great attention. And one thing which I was concerned about and I was keen not to do, and I hope I've been able to steer clear of it, is to sort of anthropomorphize. And I also didn't want to make animals these cute, cuddly things. And so I think it comes back to what Prashant was saying at the beginning, which is that there's a kind of uncertainty in this whole encounter. And that's rich for poetry. And it's hard to, that's the nature of uncertainty. It's hard to pin it down into some kind of a position about what these encounters mean. Maybe I need to be thinking about it more carefully, but that's the best I can do at the moment.
Yeah, may I just quickly respond? If you think about it, when do animals, which have appeared in literature from ancient times, when do they first become strange to human consciousness? It's really circa 1900, 1920s, not much earlier. I don't think, it's really not much earlier. And that coincides with the steam engine. It coincides with the expulsion of animal power from cities, right? Where cities depend more and more on carbon energy, right? Industrial revolution. That's when animals begin to be strange.
Hello, Siddharth sir, this is Pratik. A question was asked about the influence of Krishnamurti on your work. I've often heard you saying or talking about Arun Kolatkar as well as one of your favorite poets. So, can you tell us what is the relationship of your poetry with Kolatkar, whether in terms of similarities or contrasts, if there is any relationship?
And give Patel both. Let me just piggyback on that question.
Well, to speak of Kolatkar, yes, he's a poet I like going back to. He's obviously a remarkable poet to have created bodies of work in Marathi and in English, both significant. And I think his looking has an enviable quality in it. It's a quality of, again, I would say, attention. I was going to say pure attention, but I don't know. I think the word pure doesn't do justice to Kolatkar because it suggests something sort of sanitized. And whereas Kolatkar looks very closely, but you also sense an extraordinary intelligence behind that looking, which is sometimes humorous, sometimes sardonic, uh, sometimes just quietly accepting of whatever's happening, whether it's in Jejuri or whether it's in, the Kala Ghoda poems, just sort of taking the world on its own terms and seeing the marvel in that. And it feels as if everything is extraordinary in a Kolatkar poem. And maybe that's what draws me to him. And well, you mentioned Give. I would say that in Give's case, I'm less conscious of his influence on me as a poet, but I regard him very highly as a friend and mentor. It was really thanks to him, I think, that my first book was published by Sahitya Academy. And maybe at the end, if there's time, I'll read a short poem about him because the Compass Bird is actually dedicated to him. He died just about the time that the book was being finished. But one thing important, I think, that I learned from Give was in this whole business of editing. You see, he used to do these workshops with children in Rishi Valley year after year for many years. And in response to the workshops, children would write poems and he would look over them once he went back to Bombay. And the next year, he would sit with the same children and show them how their poems needed to be edited. And I think more than anything else, his approach lay in cutting out the stuff that came in the way of what was true in the poem. It's something I referred to earlier in our conversation as well. So writing, you think of writing as an additive process, and it is that, but it's also the temple at like the temples at Ellora or something. It's also a chiseling process. It's also a process in which you're hewing out something from what already exists. It's not only a building up, but it's also a cutting down, if you see what I'm saying. And I saw how he did that, and that was interesting to watch. And I think that's been important for my writing.
Hey, I'm Anish. The poem about the nail guy and the animals deeply resonated with me. Uh, just a point that I wanted to make about animals have been like maybe not in the written tradition, but they have been talked a lot in local traditions. So you in mythology they are talked about a lot. So just a question that I had in my mind, I just lost it when I was listening to you. So it was 1 second. Sorry. Yeah, so in mythology, it's said that you should not, when an animal looks at you, or like mostly about cats, you should not look back at it. It's just, I don't know, it's just a myth or something which we don't know. But and okay, I'll get back to you when I get that question in my mind.
Sure. I mean, that itself is an interesting comment, because so many of these poems, and we're talking about this two-way act of looking. I think partly what you're saying is a very practical thing. Uh, one of the things I like to do is to spend time outside walking or jogging. And what I have to be mindful of is dogs. And they say the best way to avoid provoking a dog is not to look at it, is to not meet its eye, because then it doesn't know what to make of the fact that you're looking at it. So maybe what you're speaking about, which perhaps appears in mythology, I didn't know about that, but it might arise from something which is very practical and very true. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if it was not a Nilgai but a panther, I don't think I'd be gazing at it soulfully. Well, I do have a leopard poem, but let's not go into that. Yes.
Hi, this is Ram Kumar. So just sharing an experience I've gone through while looking directly into an animal's eyes and connecting that with this whole subject of awareness. So I've had one experience where in Serengeti, Africa, where a lion looked at me in the eye, and that special quality of fear is something that I've never experienced before or after. But in this particular case, I think when I look into an animal that I know is not, it's not going to harm me, like a Nilgai, I think there are two things that happen. One is there is a moment where you're aware of the moment, and I think that came out very clearly through the poetry. But unlike the moment when you look a human being in the eye and you become very conscious of yourself, when you look at an animal in the eye, my personal experience is that you lose your sense of identity. So I was just reminded of that. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that, on especially the second part and whether it comes out in any of your poetry.
Thank you. I mean, that's a very interesting observation. It's probably much harder to look people in the eye unself-consciously, because, of course, human relationships tend to be more complicated than animal-human relationships. So yes, I think you're right. Yeah. So there are poems I've written about people, but perhaps fewer than there are poems about animals. Yeah. Well, we're almost running out of time, so maybe one last question if there is one. No. Okay, yeah. Do you
No,
have
go
something?
ahead with the poem.
Okay, so maybe I'll just read this and we'll finish with this. When this book was being sort of put together, Guy phoned me one day to say that he had a terminal cancer. And as soon as I could, I went to Bombay to meet him. And he was at that time at home with his daughter. And I spent some time with him. And then later, when his condition deteriorated, he was shifted to a kind of care home outside Pune. And I felt I wanted to meet him. So I went again and met him. And this last thing I'd like to read to you is a small sequence, yet again a sequence. You see, these habits die hard, of 4 poems that were written about that last meeting. And the poem as a whole is called Rare Bird, which is appropriate since it's in this book. The first poem is called As If. He is not in the ward. The bed is rumpled, as if a quick escape has been effected. She looks around the corner and with a smile beckons, as if a rare bird were to be seen. He's at the far end in a wheelchair, facing away as if all the past were on the brink. But when you take his hands, they are warm, so warm, as if nothing. Still warm when you leave. The she in the poem is his daughter, Avan. The second poem is called Grey Sweater. You tell him you recognize the gray sweater that lies folded beside the pillow. You say it heartily, and he turns his head in acknowledgement. But why would he need it so far from the winter blue that gets the mountains so near? Does he hear you? The third poem is called Mangoes. He asked, and it is October, for a mango from your city. Like a wanderer of myth, you traversed the earth's farthest reaches, which is to say the mall's ground floor hypermarket, from which you emerged unscathed with a bag of mangoes, hard enough to take the journey. These you now produce, and his yellowing eyes light up. He feels one all around. 2 days, he says. And the last poem is called Taking Leave, probably appropriate for this occasion as well. And it is time to leave. She said he doesn't want to linger. Nor do you, and wouldn't, even if the station were less far. Time to leave, but he has drifted into sleep. Then his eyes open. You bend nearer as if he would not hear and reach clumsily for his hands. They grasp yours, and as if he were on stage, he forms the word discernibly and pronounces it with eyebrows raised. Goodbye. You could not have done it better. Birds of a feather. So, thank you.